The first time I heard someone say we should never return to the moon was in the summer of 1990. I was 12 years old, sitting on the cold concrete steps outside my grandfather's farmhouse, watching him fix an old radio that barely worked. The sky above us was clear, and the moon hung low, pale and calm, like it had been quietly listening to us for years. I didn't expect him to say anything strange. He was a man of logic, a man who trusted what he could touch. But the moment that faint signal came through the radio and hissed in a way I had never heard before, his hands froze. The screwdriver slipped from his fingers. And he whispered almost to himself, "We should have never gone there. And we must never return." I remember turning toward him, waiting for him to chuckle or smile or call it a joke. But he didn't. His face tightened the same way it did when he talked about the war or the friends he'd lost. Except this time he wasn't thinking about people. He wasn't thinking about Earth at all. He kept staring at the moon like it had personally wronged him. Like it was more than a glowing rock in the sky. Back then, I didn't understand why he reacted that way. The moon was something we learned about in school as a place of progress, exploration, hope. The astronauts were heroes. The landings were historic. But the way my grandfather spoke that night made it feel different, like the moon held memories that the rest of the world had chosen to forget. And even though I didn't know it then, that moment was the beginning of everything. The questions, the interviews, the classified stories whispered to me decades later by people who claimed NASA had left out important parts of the truth. As I grew older, I started hearing more rumors. Strange transmissions from Apollo crews, unexplained lights on the lunar surface, moments when astronauts went silent for minutes and only resumed speaking when they were back in public channel range. People online argued about it constantly. Some said the missions had uncovered something ancient. Others said it was simply technical issues, nothing more. No one agreed. But my grandfather's words stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind every time I saw a documentary or read a declassified file. By the time I was in college, he was gone, taking the real story with him. I tried asking my grandmother about it once, but she shook her head and muttered, "That man heard things he shouldn't have. It changed him." She never explained what those things were. She never talked about it again. But 53 years after the final Apollo mission, the silence surrounding the moon hadn't faded. It had only grown stranger. Throughout the 80s and 90s, every time someone proposed a return mission, budgets collapsed, priorities shifted, and politicians suddenly lost interest. It was odd. Humanity had advanced in every direction, computers, satellites, deep space probes, but somehow the moon, the closest celestial body to Earth, stayed untouched. Some people joked that it was too boring to revisit. Others believed there were reasons we weren't told about, reasons hidden behind technical language and mission restrictions. In 1990, something unusual happened that pulled all of this back into the spotlight. A private satellite scanning the lunar surface picked up an anomaly, something geometric. Something that shouldn't have been there. The company brushed it off as sensor distortion, but the pictures leaked. I saw one in a newspaper clipping years later. It looked like a shadow, but the edges were too straight, too perfect, too artificial. Scientists dismissed it as photo artifacts. Conspiracy theorists called it proof of ancient structures. NASA didn't comment at all. They never do when things seem too difficult to explain. That same year, I found a box of my grandfather's belongings in the attic while helping my mother clean the house. Inside were his old notebooks, mostly filled with damaged sketches, scattered numbers, and bits of recordings he must have copied from the radio. One page, however, stood out. It was a crude drawing of the moon with dark marks along the southern rim, circled in red ink. Under it, in his shaky handwriting, were the words, "Not natural. Not ours. Stay away." I didn't sleep that night. I brought the notebook to a retired engineer named Larson, a man who had once worked with NASA during the Apollo era. He was in his 80s, living alone in a small apartment, surrounded by stacks of yellowing documents. He didn't speak much, but when I showed him my grandfather's sketch, his expression shifted in a way that confirmed he recognized it. He recognized something about it. He took a long breath, rubbed his forehead and said, "Some of us heard things too. Not everyone followed orders to forget." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he told me a story, one I had never heard before. During the final mission, Apollo 17, something unexpected had occurred during their time on the far side of the moon, where direct communication with Earth was cut off. There were gaps in the transcript we weren't meant to see. Moments the public never heard. Larson claimed the astronauts weren't alone up there. They saw something they couldn't explain, something that made them whisper instead of speak, something that made even the calmest men lose their composure. According to him, NASA ordered them never to discuss it again once they returned home. It was all buried under technical jargon, static interference, and anomalous readings. But the people inside the agency knew the truth. Something was up there. And it didn't want company. Larson didn't tell me what they saw. He only said this: your grandfather wasn't crazy. He was one of the last people who knew how to listen. Then he handed me a cassette tape, unlabeled, old, and almost falling apart. He said it contained a signal intercepted in 1990, one that matched a pattern NASA had recorded in the 70s but kept classified. A signal not made by any machine we recognized. I drove home with that tape in my pocket, my heart pounding, my mind racing with fear and excitement. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. It felt unreal, like a story made to scare children. But a part of me knew something big was coming. Something I wasn't ready for. That night, around 2 a.m., I finally played the tape. And the moment the audio crackled to life, something impossible happened. Something that made me freeze, just like my grandfather did 30 years earlier. Because the voice that came through the speaker wasn't human. And it was speaking English. But the worst part wasn't the voice. It was what it said. It said we should not return. And that we were already too late. The voice repeated itself over and over, broken by static, but each repetition burned into my mind. We should not return, we are watching, you are too late. I sat frozen in the dark living room, the tape spinning slowly in the old cassette player, my heart hammering as if it had recognized something I hadn't. My grandfather's warning came rushing back. He wasn't trying to scare me, he had heard this too. He had felt it. I pressed my hand against the speaker, half hoping it would stop, half hoping it would tell me more. But all I got was that strange cadence, almost like it was testing me, like it wanted to see if I understood. The words were English, yes, but the tone was alien. Not something human could naturally speak. It didn't belong here, not in my house, not on Earth. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I had heard. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe Larson had wanted to scare me. But the notebook in my hands, the sketches of the moon, and the red circles over areas that didn't belong, all of it started to feel connected. My grandfather's eyes, so intense that night, suddenly made sense. He hadn't seen just a shadow or a pattern. He had heard the warning firsthand, decades before anyone else did. I decided I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what the message meant. I started digging through the old newspapers, NASA archives, and mission transcripts. What I found shocked me. There were gaps, large, deliberate silences in recordings from Apollo 15 through 17. Moments when the astronauts' voices cut off mid-sentence, replaced only by static. Official reports called it communication interference, technical anomalies. But the timing of these silences matched what Larson and my grandfather had described. And then I found something even stranger. A memo from 1990, declassified decades later, buried in the archives with the header Lunar Exploration Advisory. It was short, only a few lines, but the message was chilling. It warned that certain areas of the moon were off-limits for exploration, not because of radiation or terrain, but because of unknown anomalies. The memo was unsigned, with no record of who issued it, but the language was firm. Do not return, it said, and under it, in typewritten letters, the words, serious consequences may result. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Serious consequences? For what? Who decides what's safe and what's not? And why had the world continued to celebrate Apollo's achievements as though nothing was wrong? My research led me to one of the last surviving astronauts from Apollo 17, a man named Commander Robert "Rob" Harris. I called him late at night, trying to hide the desperation in my voice. Surprisingly, he answered. His voice was calm, measured, almost weary. I introduced myself, explained my findings, and asked if he could tell me anything about those silences, the anomalies, the memo. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Long. And then he said simply, "You shouldn't be asking these questions. Not now. Not ever." I pressed on. "But people deserve to know. What did you see? What did you hear?" Another pause. Then a voice, quieter this time, almost a whisper, "It's not just what we saw. It's what followed us back." The line went dead. I sat there in silence, the phone still in my hand, realizing I had crossed a line. My grandfather's warnings, Larson's cassette, the declassified memo, it wasn't just about stopping humans from going back to the moon. It was about keeping us safe from something that shouldn't be disturbed. Something that, if provoked, could change everything. I couldn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the moon, serene and distant, but with those dark edges, those geometric shadows, and that unseen presence. The voice on the tape kept echoing in my mind, repeating its warning over and over. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that humanity wasn't supposed to know. that even talking about it could be dangerous. But the curiosity burned too strongly. I needed answers. I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something waiting for us on the moon, something patient, intelligent, and older than the Apollo program, older than our history books. Something that had been silently observing Earth for centuries, maybe millennia. Then one night, a new signal came through my old shortwave radio. It wasn't the same as the tape. This one was sharper, clearer, as though it had been waiting for me to tune in. I scribbled notes frantically, recording everything. The pattern was unlike anything I had ever seen. And then at the very end, the unmistakable voice returned, calm and deliberate. You were warned. They never listen. Prepare. My hands shook. Prepare? Prepare for what? I tried calling Larson again, but his apartment was empty. Friends said he had been gone for days, leaving no note. My grandfather's house felt colder than before, the shadows in the corners deeper, as though something had followed me from the tape. And the moon now seemed closer. Every night, it hung above, bright and full, almost watching me back. Something had changed. Something was awake. And I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that the warnings weren't just about history or exploration. They were about survival. Something had been waiting for us and we had ignored the signs. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but who would believe me? A retired engineer, an old astronaut, and a dead grandfather weren't enough to convince the world. And even if I tried, I feared that speaking too loudly might bring attention to something I wasn't ready to face. I realized I had only two choices: run or dig deeper. I chose the second. Because if humanity didn't learn the truth, if no one heeded the warnings my grandfather had whispered in 1990, then we might all regret the day we ever looked up at the moon as a symbol of hope and wonder. The next morning, I packed a bag with what little research I had: old transcripts, sketches, Larson's tape, and my grandfather's notebooks. I didn't know where I was going or who I would meet, but I knew one thing: I had to go to the source. The moon itself. And that's when I noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow crossing the surface of the moon. It wasn't moving like a crater or a rock. It was deliberate, almost watching me back. I froze. My heart raced. And I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the moon was no longer just a destination. It was a warning. And it was only beginning. I had no idea what awaited me there. But I knew I wasn't ready for it. Yet, there was no turning back. That I spent days preparing, though I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for. The moon had become an obsession I couldn't escape, its pale light haunting my thoughts. I started tracing every detail I could find: old mission logs, declassified documents, even sketches my grandfather had left behind. Each piece seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Something had been waiting for humans on the moon for decades, something that had left subtle warnings but had never been acknowledged. Larson's disappearance weighed on me. His warnings had been serious, almost desperate. He hadn't just walked away, something had taken him, or at least scared him enough to vanish without a trace. And yet, in the small stack of files I kept from him, there were more clues. References to lunar anomalies, patterns of light and shadow on the far side, and the strange signals from the 1970s. I began to see a story hidden in plain sight, a story that NASA and the world had chosen to ignore. I reached out to a friend, a journalist named Mara, who had a reputation for digging into mysteries the rest of the world overlooked. She was skeptical at first. "You sound like you're chasing ghosts," she said over the phone. But when I played her Larson's tape and the static-shrouded voice repeated its warning, she fell silent. The kind of silence that isn't disbelief. It's the kind that makes you realize someone is staring into something they weren't meant to see. "You need to be careful," she said finally. "This isn't just about history or exploration. If there's something out there, something real, it's not going to sit still for attention. And you're poking the hornet's nest." Her words stuck with me. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that stopping now wasn't an option. I had already crossed the line, and the moon, in its quiet, distant way, had begun to pull me in. Late one night, I noticed something unusual in the pattern of shadows on the moon's surface. The markings my grandfather had circled, the areas the memo had warned about, they weren't random. They formed a line, a path, almost like a trail left intentionally. Some of the anomalies were near craters that had been studied extensively. Some were near the Apollo landing sites. But the ones that worried me most were on the far side, areas no human had walked, areas we could only reach by satellite or probe. I began corresponding with Dr. Elena Vargas, a planetary geologist who had worked on lunar mapping for years. She was brilliant, sharp, and skeptical, but she didn't dismiss my observations outright. Most anomalies are natural formations, she told me, pointing to years of data. But there are some irregularities we can't explain. Straight lines, repeating shapes, geometries that don't occur naturally. Some of them have persisted for thousands of years. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Thousands of years? That meant whatever had left these markings was older than any human mission. Older than any civilization we know. And if it was still there, it was watching. I tried to follow up with her to ask more questions, but she became evasive. Be careful, she said once, almost under her breath. Some things don't want to be found. You don't just stumble across them and walk away unchanged. Meanwhile, my nights were haunted by dreams I couldn't explain. In one, I stood on the moon looking at a shadow that moved against the light, shifting, folding, almost breathing. I could feel eyes on me, and though I couldn't see them clearly, I knew they were intelligent. In another, the tape's voice returned, repeating fragments I hadn't noticed before. Too late, watching, prepare. It was fragmented, cryptic, but the feeling of urgency was unmistakable. I decided to dig into the history of lunar missions, looking for anything that might explain why humanity had been warned and why those warnings were ignored. Apollo astronauts had been told to record only certain things, to ignore anomalies, to never speak of what they saw on the far side. Many of the transcripts were redacted. Some missions had missing hours. Others had recordings that simply didn't make sense. Noises that weren't mechanical, shadows that shouldn't have existed, signals that came from nowhere. I reached out to a retired engineer named Martin, who had worked on lunar navigation systems in the 1970s. When I showed him the patterns and anomalies, his face went pale. "You found what we were told to forget," he said, voice shaking. "There were things we weren't supposed to encounter. Signals, presences, structures. We were told to record them but never follow up. To ignore them entirely. And most of us did. Most of us obeyed." I asked him what he meant by structures and presences, but he refused to elaborate. "Some of it is still active," he said. "Some of it can still see us." The thought was terrifying. Something on the moon, unseen but intelligent, had been waiting for humanity. And we had walked blindly into its orbit. Meanwhile, Mara and I began investigating unusual lunar signals from private satellites, signals that seemed to mimic human patterns. They weren't constant, but they appeared at specific locations, seemingly reacting to probes or orbiters. We documented them carefully, marking their coordinates, tracking timing. Something, or someone, was aware of our instruments and perhaps even aware of us. The more we investigated, the more I realized that this wasn't just about curiosity. There were layers of secrecy and suppression. Governments, corporations, scientists, all had brushed aside strange phenomena for decades. But the anomalies persisted. They were patient, waiting, watching. And now, with our renewed interest in returning to the moon, we were close to crossing whatever line had been drawn centuries ago. Every step closer brought tension, dread, and fascination. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow I had seen crossing the lunar surface the night I decided to pursue this, about the strange voice repeating its warnings, about the people who had disappeared after asking too many questions. And yet I couldn't turn away. I felt like I was on the edge of discovering something monumental, something that could change everything we knew about the moon, our place in the solar system, and perhaps the universe itself. But with each clue, each anomaly, I also felt the danger growing. Something was alive up there, intelligent, patient, and ancient. It didn't want visitors. It didn't want explorers. And it had already warned us not to come back. As I prepared for the next phase of investigation, tracking signals, gathering historical records, reaching out to people who had worked on lunar missions, I realized the real conflict wasn't just the unknown on the moon. It was the struggle between humanity's curiosity and survival. Between the desire to explore and the warnings that begged us to stop. Between what we could see and what we couldn't, between truth and the danger of facing it. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I knew that ignoring it wasn't an option. Because the moon was not empty. It was waiting. And whatever was waiting, was aware of me. The closer I got to the truth, the more everything around me seemed to tighten, as if some invisible force was aware of my movements. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow deeper. Even the moon, once distant and comforting in its pale glow, now seemed to loom over me like a silent sentinel, judging every step I took. I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself was watching, stretching moments into eternity while I scrambled to connect fragments of warnings, sketches, and signals that had been buried for decades. Mara and I had tracked the anomalies for weeks, noting their patterns, their odd reactions to satellite movements, and their eerie timing. They seemed almost intentional, like something, or someone, was monitoring us, guiding us, warning us. Every time I plotted another point on the map of lunar anomalies, I felt the weight of eyes following me, unblinking, patient. It was terrifying but impossible to stop. Then came the message. Not from a tape, not from a satellite, but directly, unmistakably. It appeared as a series of anomalies in our data, sharp, geometric patterns that formed letters, simple words, warnings embedded in the light reflected from the moon's surface. I stared at the screen in disbelief. "You shouldn't be here," it spelled. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I had imagined it. But the letters shifted, slowly forming another word: prepare. I wanted to run, to leave it all behind, but I couldn't. The urgency in the voice, in the warnings, demanded attention. Something had been waiting for humanity for centuries. And now it had noticed us again. We started seeing strange occurrences on Earth too. Subtle at first. Satellites flickering, communication delays that didn't make sense, odd static in radio channels we hadn't expected to be active. But the pattern was unmistakable. Whatever was out there wasn't limited to the moon. It had reach, intelligence, and awareness. And it wasn't passive. I couldn't help thinking of Larson and my grandfather. Their warnings weren't about superstition. They were about survival. I felt a growing dread in my chest, a realization that the moon was only the beginning. Every anomaly we uncovered, every signal we intercepted, every shadow we noticed pointed to the same truth. Something alive, patient, and ancient had been waiting, watching, and now it was aware that we had noticed it. One night, Mara and I were working late, tracing a particularly strange pattern of reflected signals from the far side of the moon. The anomalies formed shapes that didn't correspond to natural geography. Lines, curves, spirals, geometries that were deliberate, precise, almost architectural. And then, suddenly, a sharp spike appeared in the data, followed by a sound in the speakers. Low, vibrating, almost alive. It wasn't language, not yet. It was a presence, a communication, but one our minds struggled to understand. It made the hair on my arms rise, the back of my neck ache. "It's responding," Mara whispered, eyes wide, staring at the screen. "It knows we're here." I nodded, my throat tight. I wanted to ask what it meant, what it wanted, but words failed me. All I knew was that we had crossed a line. The tension kept building in ways I couldn't explain. Shadows moved differently in my apartment. The lights flickered at strange intervals. Even my dreams became fragmented and terrifying. Visions of astronauts walking on the far side, figures that weren't human emerging from craters, signals that seemed to reach out across space and time. And every time I woke, the moon was there, pale and distant, but now it felt close, almost sentient. Watching. I tried to involve other experts, scientists, engineers, former mission personnel, but most refused to talk. Some outright warned me to stop. One former astronaut, whom I won't name, said over the phone, "You're tempting forces that aren't meant to be provoked. Curiosity is natural, but this is different. The moon isn't just a rock. It's a boundary. And boundaries are dangerous to cross." Mara and I realized we had to go further, to dig deeper into archives that no one had touched for decades. We started accessing old mission logs, experimental probe data, and even audio from secret lunar communications that had been declassified but barely noticed. Every file, every recording, every image pointed to the same unnerving conclusion: the moon had secrets. Big ones. And those secrets had consequences. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I noticed something impossible. On a photograph taken during Apollo 17, long considered clear and ordinary, there was a figure in the shadows of the crater edge, tall, angular, and unmoving. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a flaw in the image. But when I cross-referenced it with other photos, the same figure appeared, subtly shifted in position, but still unmistakable. It wasn't a human. It wasn't equipment. It was something else. Something that had been there before humans arrived and had lingered ever since. The moon, I realized, had been alive in its own way. Not biological, not as we knew it, but aware. Watching. Judging. Waiting. And humanity had never listened to the warnings because they had been subtle, easily dismissed. That's when the signals intensified. Static bursts, geometric messages, sudden spikes in readings, things that weren't meant to be noticed by casual observers. It was as though the moon itself, or whatever inhabited it, was reacting to our renewed interest. And with that reaction came a growing sense of urgency, a pressure I couldn't explain. Mara and I began noticing changes in ourselves. Sleep was impossible. Anxiety became unbearable. A feeling of being observed, of being tested, followed us everywhere. Our instruments picked up anomalies that moved, shifted, even seemingly avoided detection, as if intelligence was guiding them. The climax was approaching, I could feel it. Something massive, patient, and intelligent was preparing to reveal itself, or perhaps to warn us one final time. Every clue we uncovered, every signal we traced, brought us closer to understanding the full scope of the moon's secrets. But with understanding came terror. One night, as we traced another strange pattern of reflected signals, the low, vibrating hum returned, this time unmistakable. It pulsed through the instruments, through the floor, through the walls, even through the air. Mara froze, her hand hovering over the keyboard. I felt it in my chest, a resonance that wasn't sound, it was presence. Something vast and ancient was aware we were here. And it was no longer hiding. The voice, or what I can only call the voice, emerged through the signal, clearer than ever, almost human in its cadence but impossibly old, impossibly aware. You should have stayed away. You are too late. Prepare. The words hung in the air, echoed through the instruments and lingered in my mind. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed to stop, to leave, to abandon the research. But a darker instinct, one that burned with curiosity and fear, held me fast. I knew that whatever awaited on the moon, it would not wait forever. And then the shadows on the lunar surface shifted again. Not natural. Not random. Calculated. Patient. Watching. And I realized with a cold certainty that the climax, the confrontation, the revelation, whatever it would be, was only moments away. But we weren't ready. And the moon, silent and distant, waited. Just when I thought the moon had revealed all it intended, the second twist hit me like a thunderclap. The signals we were tracing, the strange pulses, the geometric anomalies, the cryptic warnings, began to respond to something we hadn't even realized we were doing. At first, it seemed random, but then the pattern became clear. Every time Mara or I discussed our findings aloud, every time we shared theories or connected dots, the moon, or whatever was on it, reacted. Coordinates shifted slightly, new anomalies appeared, and the hum grew louder. It was as if it had been listening all along. I felt a cold dread settle over me. Not only was the moon aware of our instruments, our probes, and our observations, it was aware of our minds, our thoughts, our intentions. Every step we took, every word we spoke, every question we asked was being monitored. And then the chilling realization hit me, this wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a test. The second twist came hours later, in a set of images I had been studying obsessively. They were supposed to be mundane photographs of lunar terrain, but one frame, almost imperceptibly, showed movement. At first I thought it was a shadow, but it shifted impossibly fast, moving across craters in patterns no human or natural phenomenon could replicate. And then, in the corner of the frame I saw it, a structure. It wasn't just a shadow or a shape. It was an enormous geometric formation, metallic in appearance, reflecting sunlight in ways that made it almost invisible to the naked eye. I couldn't breathe. The moon wasn't just hiding anomalies. It was hiding something artificial. Something intelligent. Something older than any mission, older than humanity itself. And it had been here, silently, observing, waiting. Mara looked over my shoulder at the same image and went pale. It's alive, she whispered. Or at least it's functioning like some kind of machine or organism. I don't know. That was when the third signal hit. Unlike anything before, it wasn't just a hum or a pattern. It was deliberate, almost urgent. It pulsed directly through the instruments, through our computers, even vibrating faintly through the walls. And then, in a voice that sounded more human than any previous attempt, it spoke in a sentence that made my blood run cold. You have seen too much. They are awake. They? I asked, barely able to speak. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the signals escalated, geometric messages moving across the lunar surface, coordinates forming impossible sequences, signals that could no longer be explained as random or natural. Whatever was on the moon wasn't just intelligent, it was aware of our awareness, and now it was reacting to it. The stakes had just risen exponentially. We weren't merely investigating anomalies or ignoring warnings. We had triggered something. Something patient, something that had observed humanity for decades, perhaps centuries. And now it had fully acknowledged our presence. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every flicker of light outside, every shadow in my room, every hum from the equipment made my skin crawl. And then I noticed it, the first real sign that it wasn't content with observation anymore. A satellite, one of the private ones we had been tracking, began behaving strangely. Its orbit shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Instruments failed simultaneously across different locations. And a faint, low-frequency hum resonated in my chest, matching the signals we had traced from the moon. I called Mara immediately. It's not just the moon anymore, I said, voice trembling. It's reaching out here. She didn't respond at first. Then finally she whispered, I know. I saw it too. The satellite, it's not following physics. Something is moving it. We both sat in silence, staring at the instruments, realizing the scope of what we were dealing with. The moon wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a presence, a force capable of influencing the Earth itself. And now it was aware that we were actively searching, actively listening, actively trying to uncover its secrets. I thought back to the messages on the tape, my grandfather's warnings, the red circles in his notebooks. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had been warned for decades. But this second twist, the moon reaching beyond its surface to manipulate objects on Earth, was something none of us could have anticipated. The danger was no longer distant, it was immediate. We debated what to do. Should we continue? Should we stop? Every instinct screamed to abandon the research, to pretend we hadn't noticed, to turn off the instruments and forget everything. But we couldn't. Curiosity, fear, and the drive for understanding pulled us forward, even as the stakes grew higher. Every step felt like a step deeper into a trap we couldn't escape. And then, just as dawn broke, a new message appeared on the screen, flashing in bold, impossible letters. You have disturbed the silence. Prepare for consequences. The words lingered longer than the screen itself. I could feel them in my chest, in my head, in my very being. It was no longer a warning. It was an announcement. Something on the moon was ready to act. I looked at Mara, her eyes wide, filled with the same terror and determination I felt. We can't ignore this, she said quietly. Whatever it is, it's not stopping. And I realized she was right. We had uncovered a truth that humanity wasn't meant to see. A truth that had consequences we couldn't fully comprehend. And the moon, silent for centuries, was no longer patient. The shadow I had seen months ago, the strange figure in Apollo photos, the signals, the hums, they were all converging. Whatever lay on the far side of the moon, whatever intelligence had waited so long, was now fully aware of us. And as I stared at the pale glow of the moon through the window, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The climax, the confrontation, the revelation, whatever it would be, was approaching faster than we could prepare for. The moon had awoken. And now, so had we. The night we realized the moon was no longer just a silent observer, it felt like the entire world had paused. The signals had grown impossible to ignore, pulsating through the instruments, through the walls, even through the air around us. Mara and I sat side by side in the dark, eyes glued to the screens, hearts hammering. Every anomaly, every pattern we had traced for months, now converged into something coherent, something alive. Then it happened. The far side of the moon, the hidden terrain no probe had mapped in detail, lit up on the satellite images. Not with sunlight, but with a strange, reflective glow, shifting in ways that made the craters and ridges seem like living veins. The structures my grandfather had drawn decades ago, the patterns I had traced on photographs, all formed one continuous, colossal shape, a lattice of geometry that defied explanation. And at its center, an opening appeared, almost like a door, radiating a light that seemed to pulse in response to us, as though the moon itself had a heartbeat. I barely breathed as the voice returned, clearer than ever, louder and almost inside my mind. You have arrived. You see what was hidden. You know what you should not. Prepare to understand. Understand what? I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer. Mara didn't respond. She was frozen, staring at the screen, her face pale. The moment we had feared had come. The moon was no longer distant, it was active. And it wanted to communicate in a way that transcended language, transcended our understanding. Then, inexplicably, the satellite readings spiked, showing movement across the lunar surface. Figures, tall, angular, impossibly still and precise, emerged from the shadows of the structure. They didn't walk or crawl, they shifted, slid, or floated. It was as if they existed slightly out of sync with reality itself. The second twist revealed itself in full. The moon wasn't merely home to an ancient presence, it had been a prison. Or at least, a containment of something far older than humanity. The voice, calm yet omnipresent, explained in fragments that seeped into my mind. We watched. We waited. You freed them. I recoiled. Freed them? Mara gasped, her voice breaking. What? Who? And then I saw it. The figures weren't alone. Behind the central structure, massive shadows stretched across the lunar plains, shapes that had been hidden from humanity for centuries. They weren't just intelligent, they were predators of thought, entities that could manipulate perception, reality, and gravity itself. And now, our curiosity had drawn them out. Panic clawed at me. We have to stop this, I said, fumbling with the instruments, trying to send some kind of signal, some warning, anything. Mara shook her head, tears streaming. There's no stopping it. Not anymore. They've been patient for centuries. We crossed the line. The structure shifted, almost breathing. The moon trembled, subtly but undeniably. And for the first time I felt it, not in the instruments, not in the signals, but in the air, in my chest, in my very soul. The moon was alive. Not in the sense we imagined, but conscious, aware, and capable of judgment. Then the unthinkable happened. The figures began to respond directly to our presence, their geometries twisting into shapes I could barely comprehend. The voice returned in my mind, clear and omnipotent. You were warned. You came anyway. Now you will see and survive only if you accept. And in that moment I realized the ultimate truth. Humanity had never been meant to simply explore the moon. Our curiosity, our ambition, had triggered a reckoning we barely understood. The moon had been a guardian, a boundary, and we had crossed it. I felt a pressure, a pull, like a gravitational force stronger than anything on Earth. The images on the screen blurred, then sharpened. The shadows stretched, elongated, and then converged toward the central structure. A single, massive form emerged, impossibly tall and shimmering, radiating light and intelligence, and the voice crystallized into words that no human should hear aloud. You are witnesses. You are chosen. You will carry what you have seen. Mara and I could barely move. Our instruments failed, our technology meaningless in the presence of something so ancient and aware. The moon was no longer a destination. It was a revelation, a living entity that had tested us, judged us, and now marked us. And just when I thought the climax had reached its peak, the final twist struck. The voice whispered almost tenderly into my mind, the watchers were only the first. The moon was never alone. They're coming. And now they know you. The satellites went dark. The glow on the lunar surface vanished. The figures retreated into the shadows, leaving only the outline of the structure, still shimmering faintly, still waiting. Mara and I sat in stunned silence, our breaths shallow, our minds racing. We had survived, yes. We had understood, yes. But the moon's secret, the ancient presence, and now the warning about others meant that the danger was far from over. Whatever had been contained, or waiting, was not done. Not by a long shot. And as I looked up at the moon, calm and serene from Earth's perspective, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The story wasn't about returning to the moon. It was about survival. About knowledge that humans were never meant to possess. And about a reckoning that had only just begun. The moon had revealed its truth. And the universe had just taken notice of us. The days after that night were surreal. Mara and I barely slept, our minds replaying every moment of what we had witnessed on the moon. The structure, the figures, the warnings, it wasn't just history. It was now part of our lives, part of the world in a way that no one else could understand. Every news channel, every social media feed, carried reports about renewed lunar exploration, private missions, and plans to return to the moon. And every time I heard a rocket launch or a new announcement, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. The moon had already shown us what it was capable of. It had tested humanity. And it had marked us. We knew we couldn't reveal the full truth. Nobody would believe it, not the scientists, not the governments, not even the general public. The anomalies, the signals, the artificial structures, they could all be dismissed, explained away. And yet, I had a sense that some part of the moon's intelligence had left a seed of awareness in us. Mara felt it too. Every time we looked up at the night sky, the moon seemed to watch us differently now, closer, almost expectant. I went back to my grandfather's notebooks, searching for answers I had missed the first time. One passage stood out, written in his careful hand decades ago. Curiosity is a gift, but some doors are not meant to open. Listen, observe, survive. I realized then that his warning wasn't about fear, it was about understanding limits. Humanity had crossed those limits, and we had lived to tell the tale. That alone was a lesson worth carrying forward. Mara suggested we document everything carefully, not as proof for the world, but as a record for ourselves and anyone else who might one day notice the signs. We traced every anomaly, every pattern of light and shadow, every signal, every whisper of movement on the far side of the moon. It became a catalog not just of observations but of survival, a blueprint for how to approach mysteries that humanity might not be ready for. We also revisited the figures in the old Apollo photographs. I realized that the shadows and shapes we had once dismissed as artifacts or tricks of light were not random. They were deliberate, markers or perhaps warnings, left by the presence long before humans set foot on the moon. Those who had walked there had glimpsed fragments, but none had truly understood. Only we, with our persistence, had started connecting the dots. That realization was humbling and terrifying. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in our daily lives. Signals from Earth's satellites occasionally flickered, but no longer with the urgency of the night of the climax. It was almost as if the moon, or whatever intelligence resided there, had accepted our understanding. Mara and I could still feel the awareness, but it no longer pulsed through our instruments as violently. It was a silent presence now, a reminder that the moon was alive, watching, patient. I thought about the warnings on the tape, Larson's disappearance, the declassified memos, and my grandfather's voice echoing in my memory. They were all part of a chain, a history that humans had ignored at their peril. The moon had been a test, a silent guardian, and in surviving it, we had learned something crucial. Curiosity could be a gift, but hubris could be deadly. There was a balance, and we had only just begun to understand it. Mara and I began to focus on what we could do moving forward. We reached out to select scientists and engineers under the guise of lunar research, sharing observations without revealing the full truth. Our goal was not to frighten, but to prepare subtly, to cultivate awareness in those who might one day approach the moon with proper caution and respect. We wanted humanity to remember the lessons, even if the full story remained hidden. One evening, I climbed to the rooftop of my apartment and looked up at the moon. It was serene, pale, and beautiful, exactly as it had always seemed. But now I saw it differently. I felt its presence, the ancient intelligence within it, patient and knowing. I whispered a promise, not knowing if it could hear me. We will remember. We will not forget. We will respect. And for a moment, I imagined a response. A subtle flicker of light, a pulse, a quiet acknowledgement that our survival and understanding had been accepted. Months passed. Life returned to a semblance of normality. Mara continued her journalism quietly, embedding warnings and subtle stories about space anomalies. I continued cataloging my grandfather's notebooks, the Apollo mission sketches, and the strange signals. Our work became a quiet duty, a responsibility to the past, present, and future. Humanity had been warned once, twice, centuries ago, and now the responsibility fell to those who had truly seen. And yet, despite the sense of resolution, a quiet tension remained. The moon's presence never left. The signals, though faint, could still be detected if one listened carefully. It reminded us that understanding came with vigilance. That intelligence, patience, and awareness stretched across space in ways humanity had only begun to perceive. The moon was not a destination anymore. It was a teacher, a sentinel, a mirror for human ambition. In reflecting on everything, I realized a truth I hadn't understood fully before. Knowledge carries consequences. Curiosity shapes destiny. And some boundaries, no matter how tempting, are there for a reason. The moon's message was clear. Humanity could reach for the stars, explore and achieve, but only if it respected limits and listened to warnings. Ignorance, arrogance, or haste could awaken forces far beyond comprehension. And finally, the last twist, a subtle, chilling reminder that kept me awake on countless nights. One morning, as I reviewed the latest satellite images of the moon, I noticed a faint shimmer along the far side, barely visible, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a structure, not exactly. It was something new, or something that had always been there, now moving, shifting, as though adjusting to our understanding. It was a silent warning, a reminder that the moon had not finished observing. That whatever patience it possessed was infinite. That our story, though concluded for now, was only a chapter in a much larger tale. I shared this observation with Mara quietly. "It's still there," I said. She nodded, her expression a mix of awe and unease. We understood the lesson fully now. Survival wasn't permanent. Knowledge wasn't free. And curiosity, though powerful, demanded respect. Looking back on it all, I realized that the moon had given us more than fear. It had given us perspective. It had reminded humanity of the vastness beyond, of intelligence older and more patient than we could comprehend, of boundaries we might never cross safely. It had shown us that exploration carries consequences and that understanding comes with responsibility. And though the moon appeared serene from Earth, I knew the truth. It was alive, aware, and patient. Waiting. Watching. And humanity, if it chose to return too soon, would find that its warnings were not merely suggestions. They were commands. I closed my grandfather's notebooks for the last time, the tapes safely stored, the recordings catalogued. Mara and I stepped outside, looked up at the pale light of the moon, and for the first time felt a quiet respect. We had survived, we had learned, and we had remembered. The moon remained distant, silent, and calm, but beneath that serene surface lay truths, secrets, and intelligence that would forever remind us. Some places are more than they seem, and some warnings must never be ignored. And though the story of that night, the moon and the warnings had ended for us, I knew humanity's next encounter with it would write a new chapter. One that demanded caution, humility, and respect for the unknown. The moon would always be there watching. And we would never forget.